Hi everyone and welcome back to the final part of the series. In this last part I'll be covering painting, masking and finishing. I know there's quite a lot of things to cover in terms of painting in general, but I wanted to keep this series resin focused, so I won't be covering everything about painting, but I'll give a little tips here and there. So overall there isn't a big difference between painting resin and painting plastic. However, usually you'll find resin kits to have less parts than normal plastic kits do, but they usually have more details than plastic kits. So what it means is resin kits usually have less part separations, and it means that you have to do more masking when you're painting. But I'll cover this a little bit later. So before you lay down any kind of color, you need to figure out which sort of base color you're using for the colors. The most common color is of course grey. But sometimes you find that for lighter colors it doesn't go on very nicely, and that's because lighter colors have less covering power than darker colors, so the base color will tend to show up more. So for this you can use a white base or a white color after grey primer, as this will sort of brighten up any color that you put on top. And similarly, if you want the colors to be darker or if you're applying metallic paint, I recommend using a black base. If you plan to paint any metal parts or photo etch parts, you'll need to use a metal primer. All it does is it helps the paint to stick on the metal parts a little better, and you have to thin it with lacquer thinner. In here I'm demonstrating the different tones that you get by applying the same color to different base colors. I'm using yellow here as an extreme case. You should never ever paint yellow on black because it just looks garbage. But hopefully you can see that the yellow with the white base has the most accurate tone. The grey is not too bad, but it's kind of dull, and the one with the black base has sort of a green tint to it. So it's worth it to test out different base colors for your actual colors. I get asked quite often my thinning ratio for paints and PSI for the airbrush, and I usually don't give any specific answers because I don't look out for them. The thing is, thinning ratios and PSIs are quite flexible anyway. For example, you can thin the paint down more and then you can afford to lower the PSI, or you can increase the PSI and not thin your paints as much. Bottom line is you just need to thin it enough so that the paint wouldn't splatter out. But on the other hand, not thin it so much that when you spray one layer it's already too wet and you have to like spray 5 or 6 layers. So what do you do when you're painting you accidentally scratch a piece? You can try to cover it with painting directly on top of it, but you will find that the scratch doesn't really go away and you can still faintly see it. Instead, you should sand the area flat again and then repaint on top. And if you have to mask, I recommend masking the entire panel away instead of just masking the scratch. And if somehow you mess things up so much that you have to remove all the paint, luckily this is very easily done with resin, because resin is a material that doesn't react to a hot thinner. So you can just put your parts into a cup of thinner and it'll remove the paint in seconds and it won't damage the resin whatsoever. So when I'm painting, I like to paint areas that are most indented first. So for this part it'll be the under armor part in the middle. The reason being, painting the indented area first will help with your masking a lot. So in terms of masking, there are 3 major ways of doing it. The first one is the simplest one, and it's just simply masking the area off. You do that when you have a large flat surface and you're painting the protruding area. Second method is masking and cutting. You do this when you have a completely flat surface and you want to mask away the different panels. Once you got the masking tape down, you can use a skewer or toothpick to sort of mark the panel lines, but I'm lazy so I usually just use my fingernails. And then you can cut the masking tape with a knife. The third method is putting a masking tape down and then cutting it with a knife into smaller shapes. This is very useful for masking indented areas, and at this size you don't have to worry about being totally straight. For masking circular areas, I like using a circle cutter. I love this thing because it cuts perfect circles and it is stepless, so it can cut from anywhere between 0.1 and 2.5 centimeters radius. And finally, you can use products like Silly Putty, Glue Tag, or in liquid form there's masking liquid. You can use them to mask complex shapes like this. So once you have done your airbrushing colors, depends on the size of the parts, you can decide to assemble it now. It all depends on whether you can still get into the tiny areas for detail painting after assembly. If not, you should leave this as a final step instead. But for this kit I did a part assembly because the individual parts are so small and it doesn't hinder me from detail painting after assembly. So after that I like to do a gloss coat. It helps protecting the paint underneath and then it prepares the surface for any waterslide decals or hand painting that you're doing afterwards. For hand painting I like to use enamel paints because enamel paints are so easy to clean up with just lighter fluid or mineral spirit. So you don't have to be precise when you're hand painting. And the same goes with Panaline liquid. This Tamiya version is basically just a really thin down enamel paint. And afterwards you can apply your decals. Nothing too different from doing it on a plastic kit. Applying photo edge part isn't too difficult. And you can just dabble 1 or 2 drops of super glue onto the surface or on the metal edge. And then you can just carefully place the photo edge onto the part. One thing you have to be aware of is not to move it around too much after you've placed the photo edge down, as the super glue will tend to smudge the paint underneath. So once you have everything done, it's time to apply your final coat. It can be a flat or a gloss, depends on what you're after. Make sure you're getting rid of as much dust and lint as possible. And after you've done your final coat, you can do your final assembly, which you shouldn't have any problems with if you have done all the correct prep work before you paint it. And here you go, you should at least now have a decent looking enough kit. And hopefully you can see that why it's essential to do all the preparations before you paint. Because you don't want to find out during painting that your paint is not sticking to the resin, or you find imperfections after you finish painting, or worse, when you're assembling you find out that your kit doesn't stand up at all. But if you follow all the steps, you should have no trouble with painting your kit. And here you've reached the end of the series. I hope you found this series somewhat useful. I know this is very different to what I do usually on this channel, and most people won't even watch this. So I really appreciate if you leave a like and comment to show some support. And I've got some really awesome projects coming up, so stay tuned and I'll see you soon.